So I want to talk about fear tonight, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of my story just to help give you some context. But I grew up in a loving home. I had loving parents, loving family, but I had a lot of physical and emotional trauma. And because of that, I dealt with a lot of fear. I had a lot of rejection, a lot of bullying, and I found myself in this fear and shame cycle. And I had a lot of loving people that spoke really amazing words over me. People would say to me, wow, you're so inspiring, you're so brave, you're so courageous. And I would hear those words, and instead of those words encouraging me, they would leave me feeling ashamed, because inside I knew that I wasn't brave. I knew that I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel courage in those moments. I endured 30 surgeries by the time I was 16. And I feel like the result of a lot of that was I had a lot of fears of being rejected, fears of people bullying me, and all throughout my school years. And so as I grew, I would hear those words and people would still tell me I was inspiring, and I would just fall into this cycle of shame. And it felt like this circling the mountain. I don't know if you've ever felt that. It feels like you're going in circles. You're never getting any forward momentum. And that was the story of most of my life. And my mom shared a quote with me from Mark Twain. And the quote was, there are two most important days in your life, the day you were born and the day you find out why. And so for me, my journey started when I started to ask myself the question, who am I and why was I born? When I started to ask myself those questions, I realized that the sneaky thing about fear is that more often than not, fear creeps in as soon as you begin to step into the things that you're called to do. Without fail, every time I would take a step in a direction that I knew I was called to step into, fear would be right there facing me, the same old fears. So I love the analogy of the oyster, the picture of an oyster. The oyster produces the pearl, and the pearl is beautiful and rare, but what we don't often know is that it actually starts as a parasite. So the parasite invades the oyster and begins to try to take over, and the oyster knows that it's there, and instead of trying to push it out, the oyster begins to coat it with fluid. And so as it's coated with fluid, layer by layer, it begins to form the pearl, which we know the pearl is beautiful, valuable, and rare. So if we think about ourselves as the oyster, think about fear and shame as the parasite. Fear and shame try to invade us, and with being unchecked, they can control us. But if we, like the oyster, begin to coat that fear and shame with truth, what we know to be true about who we are, that can help to break the cycle. I realized very early on when I started to really evaluate who am I and why was I born, that it almost always starts as a simple lie. Fear begins as a simple lie, something we don't believe that is true about ourselves or our circumstances. That simple lie begins to build into faulty belief systems. Those faulty belief systems begin to control our life decisions. And then from there, we begin to find ourselves feeling further and further away from our actual calling, which is a scary feeling. For me, when I made the decision that I wasn't going to be stuck in those patterns anymore, I had to take steps towards that direction. And for me, the very first one was to break the shame. And in order to break the shame, I had to acknowledge that I was afraid, which was the hardest part for me, to step out of the facade that I didn't have to be strong all the time. I didn't have to be brave all the time. When I stepped out of that place and I acknowledged that I was afraid and that that was okay, the shame was broken right there. The second thing was to begin to coat the fear and the shame with what I knew to be true. Who am I? Whose am I? Why was I born? What is my calling? Those truths, once I knew those things about myself, that was the second thing that helped to free me up from the fear and shame cycle. The third thing, which I think was the second hardest, was to actually begin to step forward in my calling in face of my fear, knowing that the fear would very likely still be there, that every time I would take a step, the fear was there. But because I knew what was true about myself, the fear was a little less scary each time. Even standing here today, it's scary. I don't love it. But the reality is, because I know who I am, because I know what I'm called to, I can stand here today and I can say, fear, you're not my leader. I love the quote by Stephen Furtick. He says, don't let the lack of confidence be the death of your calling. And I feel like for me, it's a God confidence, but we can't let our lack of confidence be the death of our calling. So today, standing here before you is my way of saying, fear, you are not my leader.